Hello everyone, welcome to our part 2 of our RACS showcase demonstration. Tonight we are going to take a look at the SLA faction called or Saharani Liberation Army. This is the exact opposite of the RACS itself. The RACS army is based on the Western philosophies and tanks and vehicles made from France and Britain and the US and Spain. And now we'll be taking a look at the SLA, whose vehicles and weapons are mostly based on Soviet, USSR, and Warsaw Pact weapons. Uh, Let me showcase some of the things that we have here. We got quite a lot of ground to cover, so let's get to it. Okay, so starting out the light vehicle demonstration, we have mostly variants of the venerable UAZ. Despite the fact that it was made entirely in Russia, this vehicle has good off-road capabilities. This is something that is common in most USSR vehicles that we're going to see in this demonstration. Either that they have good off-road capabilities or that they are amphibious. The reason being is that most of Eastern Europe and where the Soviets, the USSR, thought about where they're going to fight NATO in World War III if it ever were a conventional war. So they thought about it's the area where they fought the Nazis, and that area has lots of rivers, lots of bodies of water, lots of swamps, and very tricky terrain to manage and have an army cross over it. And so that's why most of their vehicles are either amphibious or they have very good off-road capabilities in order to tackle that terrain a lot better than Western armies. As you can see, we have a lot of different variants, like for instance that variant over there with the green door and the symbol is of the border guards. There are also other variants of the UAZ with the AGS, forgot its name, yeah, AGS 30, which is the Russian equivalent of the Mark 19. We have over there, sorry about the stutter, but we have over there the recoilless rifle version, light AT. We have, this is the BTR 40, which is 1940s, 1950s sort of light APC. It has no roof and is very lightly armored. And my recommendation is probably good for troop transport, not frontline activity. Let me show you just inside. Yeah, this is the driver's position. This is over there. There's the supposed gunner position, although there is no gunner over here. And over there, there's this most unique, let's say, assortment of seats that I've ever seen in a vehicle. And in the game itself, you can cramp up to uh, 7 soldiers inside. I wouldn't want to be one of those guys, but it is possible. And lastly, we have this is the GAZ, a sort of upgrade from the UAZ. This is a more common, much more modern Russian light vehicle, sort of an MRAP uh, in its configuration. However, this thing I believe does not have, despite the fact that it has 2 weapons on top, I don't think you can actually use those 2 weapons. Yeah, no, it doesn't let me to switch the turret, you see. So this is something I said earlier, that uh, most mods that include 2 weapons on the same turret, one is cosmetic and one is functional. So this is that. example of it. And otherwise, it's a very roomy vehicle, but has not much in anywhere else or any other configuration. So this is the end of the light vehicle section, and we'll be moving on to logistics. Now we're at the logistics section. We have, of course, the venerable Ural truck in various configurations. This one is closed top regular. This is ammo. This is tanker. Open top. This one is for repairs. I actually like this one because it looks like a whole workshop crammed onto a truck. A lot more believable than just a truck carrying repair supplies. This one is the flatbed, and this one is the medical or ambulance. And now we're moving on to other vehicles that are also in acting in the roles of logistics. First off is the MTLB, which is probably the most versatile weapons platform or even vehicle, of the most versatile vehicle platform that the USSR ever produced. If you've played war game, then you're absolutely familiar with this vehicle. It has multiple variants of weapons on top of it, from AT to AA to guns to artillery, and this is supposed to be an APC, by the way, and it is amphibious. Like I said before, most of their vehicles are amphibious. This one carries ammo. This one is the HQ, sorry, and this one is the battle ambulance. I just find it odd that standing, a normal person of about 180 meters height, and I'm higher than this vehicle. But this is one of the doctrines of armored warfare of the Soviets. We'll be talking about this more uh, in a little bit in the armor section. And now we're coming on to two types of vehicles, or a type of vehicle that you've probably seen doing something entirely different from being a logistics truck. I personally did not know this vehicle is uh, being used in this capacity. Of course, this is the Scud launcher called the MAZ 534 heavy transport. This one is open and this one is closed. So this is the logistics section. Again, not much to talk about, but we'll be moving on to the more interesting parts now of the APCs, tanks, uh, Revolutionary Guards, because there has to be a Revolutionary Guard section for any people's democracy worth its salt, and we'll move on from there. Alright, so now we've come to the area of the APCs and infantry fighting vehicles, and we'll be starting from the smallest and lightest armored all the way up to the Revolutionary Guard area, which is right over there. So, starting with the BRDM, this is the BRDM 2, sorry, uh, armored scout car, so or something like that. It has it packs quite a punch with that gun. This is a 12.7 millimeter gun with a 7.62 coaxial. Um, it's proven to be quite versatile in the armored car category, mostly used for border patrols and maybe scouting. This, by the way, I believe is a gun port. We'll be seeing a lot of these in Soviet vehicles back in the 50s. There was this the Soviet the doctrine called for the ability to have vehicles that the infantry inside can deploy their guns through gun ports and shoot out from the vehicle while being protected under fire. This was sort of a requirement made by the Army for any future manufacturers to develop weapon systems and vehicles that have that capacity, and we'll be seeing that a lot in all of the other vehicles that we have in store in this demonstration. But now we are looking at the BRDM, and again, so this is what I think is a gun port. Not that it is needed much because that gun is way overpowered for the role that this armored car is performing essentially. This is another variation of the BRDM, but this time it's an ATGM variant with a concourse missile, 5 of them. I believe this is a wire-guided missile. These are the ATGMs of the 1970s, where the Russians didn't have. Also, in the Western armies, you couldn't you didn't have the ability to place a radar or an infrared scanner or everything on an ATGM. It wasn't that sophisticated enough because back in that time, uh, anti-air missiles like the Sidewinders and such were also very unreliable, and they were far away from heat sources on the ground. So the technology was not developed sufficiently. So the Russians, what they did was to build a rocket that has inside that tube, there's also a wire of about a length of 2 to 3 kilometers, more or less, and through that wire, the gunner, which you can see has a new gun sight right over there, uh, he has to constantly look at the target to see where the missile is at and correct its flight path accordingly until it hits the target. It is very tricky to hit your target like that because you're firing at a target about 1.52 kilometers away, and the missile is small and your target is very small, and it's hard to keep track, especially if there are hills, rocks, trees, and everything that might obscure your vision. So it's a very sort of primitive solution to how to guide ATGMs to their targets, but it works. It kind of works. For saying the Yom Kippur War, there were the Malyutka missiles that you might know them as Saggers, that they were used in the same way, and they were modestly effective. Like the Egyptians fired lots of them on Israeli tanks, especially in the early days of the Sinai campaign. Not all of them hit, but the ones who did catastrophic damage to Israeli tanks. So yeah, if you hit anything, it will explode with this vehicle. Uh, Next up is the BRDM HQ version, which I don't think I need to speak a lot about. This is the Type 63 APC, which is the first Chinese-made APC ever. As you can see, this thing is also a gun port. The Chinese have copied sort of the Russian, not enthusiasm, but the Russian sort of way of thinking of having an APC that is not entirely dependent simply on the HMG and its gunner that is sitting above, but also has any uh, even a small amount of more firepower from the sides. So they also install these gun ports in the sides of the vehicle. Next up, this is the BTR-60, which was the staple, the mainstay APC of the Soviet armed forces back in the 60s and 70s. Um, Back in the 50s, there was this notion that people agreed upon, both the Americans and the Russians. They realized that the next war, the next world war, will be nuclear. And if you're going to fight a nuclear war, you must have vehicles that can actually survive in a nuclear irradiated wasteland. They have to survive. They have to, if not fight, in this hellish environment, then they must at least be able to transport personnel or go through it themselves without, dying. Now, we've seen, for instance, the BTR-40, which was way over there. It's an open-top vehicle. Most of the APCs of the 1950s of the Soviet Army were mostly looking like the half tracks of the Americans with the open top. So, of course, you cannot ride this thing into battle in areas where there is a nuclear or biological or chemical agents that have contaminated the area. You need something enclosed that you can seal properly, and so this is one of those vehicles that came out from that understanding, from that theory that the next war will be nuclear, and so we must have nuclear protected vehicles who can travel through those wastelands and still fight even after the nuclear weapons have dropped. So this is one of those vehicles that came out, and as you can see here and over there, there are also gun ports, and it is the same turret from the BRDM, which is a very successful turret in what it does. And this thing is, by the way, also amphibious, which connects to what I said before, that most vehicles of the Soviets either had really good off-track, off-road capabilities or were amphibious. This is the UN version of the BTR. This is the MTLB, another Soviet-made APC, which kind of bears a similarity when you look at the back of it to a BMP, possibly even sort of a basis of the chassis. Here you can see another gun port right over there. The MTLB, however, is, from what I understand, used less as an APC and more because it has a flat top right over there. It is used to house more advanced weaponry, ATGMs, AA missiles, artillery, anything that can fit on top of a vehicle that you want to move, mortars, big guns, anything, so it can fit on top of that vehicle, and that's mostly how it is used. And we're now coming on to the last of the USSR made vehicles and APCs, or sort of infantry fighting vehicles. These are of course the BMPs. First off, you can see the BMP. This is the BMP Mark 1, and you can see that there are also gun ports in the sides. At least one in, sorry for the lag, at least one in the back, and three more here. Now, before the BMP came to be, like I said, most of the Soviet APCs were open top, not nuclear, biological, chemical protected, and so the Soviets decided we want to make it an APC that fits that category of being able to transport infantry through rough terrain. So it must be tracked, it can't be wheeled, it must be tracked, it must be amphibious, and it must have the ability for all infantrymen to fire their guns outside the vehicle at all times. So this, you see those? These are the periscopes that infantry can, they can look outside, from inside into those periscopes, see more or less what's firing at them, where they should be firing their vehicles at. Then they pop off this cover and stick their guns out and fire from the vehicle. This is, by the way, what I said, the Malyutka or Sagar missile. And as you can see, this earlier turret also has a cannon for use against bunkers and entrenched enemy emplacements. This, however, is the BMP-2. Now, the BMP-2 is more or less like the BMP-1, except the turret is entirely different. First off, we have a new ATGM right over there. The Malyutka, for instance, was wire guided. This thing, I don't know. I actually don't know what this missile is, but I don't think it's wire guided. I think it's much more advanced from the 1980s that it's already able to acquire a target and lock onto a target at least in mid-flight and take out the target without the use of wire and the gunner constantly needing to give it corrections to its flight path in order to hit the target. But the biggest change of all is this autocannon. Now, here's a story. The USSR invades Afghanistan in 1979. What they find out is that mostly the Mujahideen were outside the cities. So the Soviets tried to go into the rural areas of Afghanistan in order to destroy the Mujahideen. One thing that they realized rather quickly is that most of the roads, especially in the north of Afghanistan, are actually roads that follow ravines through the mountains. So the Mujahideen, what they did most of the time was sit on top of those hills on both sides of the ravine where the road was going and just wait for a Russian convoy to pass by. And since they were so high up in the mountains, they were firing down, and the Soviets had a real hard time to actually return fire. Like the infantry could return fire, but the vehicles themselves could not elevate their guns so high in order to strike back. So this autocannon was made in order to do just that and elevate the gun a lot higher than what this gun was able to do. And also being an autocannon means it can fire more rapidly to destroy its enemies rapidly, and it became a very successful vehicle that was used later on in many conflicts around the world. And lastly, we have this thing. This is the BMD. The BMD is a sort of a BMP but made for the VDV. The VDV are the Soviet, probably still Russian, paratroopers. You can see the sign of the paratroopers right there. And what they wanted was a vehicle that will be as light as possible to be able to actually paratroop down or be carried by big airplanes like that one. I don't know if it actually fits in that one, but this is the idea of making the APC as small as possible, as light as possible, but also be able to provide fire for the VDV in the field whenever and wherever they are being deployed. So this is why they have the BMD. The BMD is also supposed to be an APC in on itself, although even smaller than the BMP. I actually don't know where the rest of the infantry is supposed to go. It says here that I can go on the back cargo. Most of the infantry that you see on Soviet vehicles are actually riding on top. This is because in Afghanistan there were a lot of IEDs, and the infantry decided that it is better for their survival to actually be outside and on top of the vehicle, so that if the vehicle rides on an IED, then the vehicle absorbs it. The crew dies. Everyone inside the vehicle dies, but the infantry on top, they might be flown away from it. They might be shocked and you know, but they will be still be alive and be able to jump away from the vehicle before it explodes further with all the ammunition inside burning up, and will also be able to return fire better against, again, infantry mujahideen that was sitting up high that no Soviet gun could elevate in order to fire. So once the shooting started, the infantry was already on top and outside, able to fire their guns back at the Mujahideen. So this is why you're constantly seeing Soviet infantrymen were sitting on top of their vehicles and not inside of them. So this is the end of the infantry fighting vehicle section, and we'll be moving on to both the ARMA section, and we'll be doing both the ARMA section and the Revolutionary Guard section all in once. So stay tuned. Okay, so now we've reached the area of the ARMA demonstration. We'll be doing, like I said before, both the ARMA and the Revolutionary Guard section. And yes, there's an elephant in the room which I will address shortly. But first, let's talk about the T-72 and the T-72 BAE-1 or BA-1E. Sorry, this is the B1 and that's the BA-1. Okay, so the T-72 is perhaps the most mass-produced tank of the 20th century, of the second half, sorry, of the 20th century. Something like 20,000, maybe more, have been built of the T-72. Is one of the best tanks considered that the USSR has ever produced. Now, I want to show you the key features of why it's so different from, say, an American M60. Let's take a look from the front. So clearly, the T-72 is much smaller, much lower target. It has a lower silhouette than the American tank, and this is on purpose, by the way. First off is the idea of the Russians sent the T-62 to completely remove the loader. So you don't need a huge turret like in the M60 where 3 guys are inside. Here are only 2 guys are inside the turret, which is the gunner and the commander. No one else is needed. There is an autoloader system. Many speculated that the autoloader is in fact better than a loader in the tank. However, most armies, both Germany, Britain, and the United States, have conducted a series of tests regarding having an autoloader in their tanks and found out that the tank is actually firing faster and better when there is a loader that takes care of all the shells inside and puts the correct shell, and well, a loader never jams, so there is that. But the loader in most West armies, the loaders are trained to be able to fire faster than the autoloader in Soviet tanks. So you're asking, well, why have an autoloader? Well, the simple answer is, like I said before, keep the turret small. By removing some guy from the turret, you can make it a lot smaller than what the Americans are doing, making it a much harder target for the enemy to see. The tank is lower. The tank itself, as you can see, is lower by several centimeters, but the turret itself, there's almost a meter of difference between the highest point on an M60 and the highest point of the T-72. This is, by the way, something that I talked about also in the part 1. This is the cupola that I mentioned that the commander had, which has its own machine gun and it can fire at other targets than what the tank is looking at. However, it raised the silhouette so high that it was a vulnerable point, so they removed it. So, anyways, what else does the T-72 has? Well, first off, this thing can fire ATGM missiles from its barrel. So, you can see there is one gunner sight over there where my rifle icon is, the inventory. Yes, right there is a sight. Here, however, you can see 2 sights for the gunner, and I believe one of them is the regular and one is to guide ATGMs to their targets. Next thing that this thing has, there is a sort of advancement and advantage, sorry, over the M60, is this thing. You probably don't know what this thing is, but this is an infrared flashlight. What they're used for is in night fighting. They turn on this infrared flashlight, and you cannot, in your naked eye, see that even at night. What it gives the gunner is the ability to more or less distinguish and actually acquire and identify targets in the middle of the night. So this tank actually had, back in the 1970s when it came out, it already had limited night fighting capabilities, something that no Western tank had. For instance, in the Yom Kippur War, in the second day of the Golan Heights campaign, where there were tank fights that were in the distances of, let's say, if the Israelis and the Syrians came out of their tanks and threw rocks at each other, they would hit them like at that distance of like 5, 10, 15 meters. These were knife fights with tanks, essentially. And that infrared flashlight was tested in 1973 in combat conditions and was found to be uh, modestly effective at acquiring targets. There are reports from from the Israeli commanders who were, one of them at least, was using NVG binoculars. The gunner did not have any way to identify targets in the night. However, the commander was sticking out his head out of the turret with an NVG goggles, NVG binoculars, and he spotted the flashlight through the NVGs, but without them he couldn't see it, and through that he realized that it must be a Syrian tank because the Israelis didn't have that capability, and that's mostly how they identified Syrian tanks in the night. However, this is just one case. In most of other cases, people did not know about it. It was something that the Soviets had that the West was did not have any counterpart for it, and essentially Western tanks up until the 1980s were not equipped with NVGs, as far as I know. Maybe I'm wrong. Correct me in the comments below. So other than NVGs and the small tank, and like I said, it can also fire ATGMs. Now, this is something that really scared, or not scared, but made Western tacticians worry, because the reflex missile that this thing can fire has about a range of 5 kilometers. Most of the vehicles, like for instance this thing with the 105 rifled gun, can most of the time it was expected to fire and engage targets between 1500 to 2000 meters. The Israelis, who stood on high ground and uh, entrenched positions on the Israeli side of the Valley of Tears in 1973, were able to snipe T-62s of the Syrians who were coming down below through the valley at about 2500 meters, and that was considered long range sniping in terms of tank warfare. However, this thing was able to fire an ATGM that would hit a Western tank up from 5 kilometers. So this thing essentially outranged all of the armor, all of the tanks of the West. So whenever you hear that, it makes you kind of worry about going into fighting one of these. However, this is the thing about Soviet vehicles, is that on paper at least, they it makes you feel like they're a real menace. And this vehicle might be very effective in combat in the time that it was produced. But I think essentially the the reason why it is seen as an ineffective tank and more like a scrap heap of tank nowadays is because it was misused, and it is used not effectively. It is not used correctly by the armies that wield it, and this is why. And its crews are wholly untrained compared to their Western counterparts, which makes it not really an even fight. Even if it's a menace of a machine, but the guys inside barely know how to operate it, then it's more like a paper tiger or something like that. So it's something to keep in mind. But there is a lot of thought that goes, and it goes uncredited. The Soviet tank designs relatively go without credit, but there went a lot of thought into producing those vehicles, uh, which also came with a massive which also came with a massive weakness, sorry, of you sitting on 22 exposed rounds and even the smallest flash of fire in the turret, that ammo explodes and your turret goes flying. So that was one massive disadvantage. Of course, the Russians made 20,000 of these, so a few popped turrets would not deter the Russian commanders from using these in the field. Of course, the value of life in the Russian army is not that high. Uh, not something that you're supposed to be surprised from. But yeah, so anything. This is anyway. Sorry, this is the T-72 BA1E. Sorry. Most striking differences between these is of course the Contact 1 ERA, which is explosive reactive armor. Explosive reactive armor works by if you have a say a warhead that is exploding on the tank and trying to force its way through the armor, then the ERA explodes back on it and sending it backwards, outwards, away from the vehicle. This is also made out of passive explosive, meaning that if you fire regular rounds at it, it will not explode. And it actually requires either fire or electricity in order to trigger. Very cool. Besides that, there's also a new power unit, and I believe a new gunner sight. Maybe? Or maybe not. I once tried crewing one of these, and there are a lot of options that were given to me in the gunner position, but I could not find NVGs in this thing. So, again, I don't think. I know this serves a purpose, that infrared flashlight, though I don't think it works in the context of this game. Now we're moving on to the area of the Revolutionary Guard, because any democratic republic, any people's democratic republic worth its salt must have some sort of Republican Guard or Revolutionary Guard or some mainstay unit that receives better pay and better equipment than the regular army. Don't know why, don't ask me why, but kind of a dictatorship thing to have a unit that the army is already loyal to you because you're the dictator, but most of them make a unit that is better than the army so that they will be even more loyal in case of a coup. You know how dictators and the wacky thoughts go. So, so this is the Revolutionary Guard of the SLA. This is the BTR 80, which is an advancement over the BTR 60. First off, it's a new vehicle almost entirely. You can see there's a new engine, a new power pack in the back. The gun ports are bigger and there's a lot more of them right over here. This, by the way, is the escape hatch. This is where infantry come in. The doors over here, they open down, and this thing opens like that, and that's how you enter the vehicle, essentially. Uh, this is now the mainstay of Russian forces wheeled APCs, and of course there is an even better version for the Republican Guard. This thing comes with an autocannon instead of the 12.7 millimeter, which is just about the same turret as the, if I'm correct, is just about the same turret as the BTR-60, but here is a more advanced turret that can also elevate its gun way higher than usual. Again, due to the lessons learned from Afghanistan and the need to have vehicles that can raise their guns high in order to attack infantry in high positions inside inside buildings and on rooftops and on hilltops. And by the way, this thing also came in handy when the Russians advanced onto Chechnya. I don't think that in 1996 it helped much, but in 1999 there was both in 1996 and 1999 were big battles in Grozny where the Chechens were sitting on the rooftops and in high floors of high-rise buildings and shooting down at the convoys of the Russians, because I don't know why the Russians have that. I don't know if it's called mentality, but they have this sort of need to have extremely exposed convoys going through lanes that, like, the one lane convoy that is textbook for ambushes. I don't know why they keep doing it. Tell me in the comments below why they keep doing it, because I know they keep doing it in Ukraine right now. Why? Change your tactics. You're predictable. Anyways, so this thing came in handy because it can elevate its gun to fire at rooftops and annihilate any insurgents and rebels that were stationed there. And the same goes for the BMD-2, which also has its autocannon straight out of the BMP, and a newer ATGM, as well as a neat camo. You can see these guys they don't have almost no camo at all. They come like from stock paint from the factory. But these guys, nope, they get their new camo so that you will know that these guys are the Revolutionary Guard. They are the real deal. And lastly, they have this thing. This is an even bigger menace than the T-72, though built in quite lower numbers. This is the T-80. The T-80 comes with an improved infrared flashlight, better gun sights for the crew and for the gunner and commander. It comes with the Contact 5 ERA, which is a more advanced ERA armor. They also have these blow-up panels right here. If you've seen the back of the Merkava has a sort of dreadlocks, so that if anything that explodes, like RPGs, is fired into that area where the hull meets the turret, then it explodes on those dreadlocks instead of going inside and into the area where the turret meets the hull. So what this thing does is more or less the same. Uh, but just like those dreadlocks, it is built in order to prevent so that it won't inhibit the way the turret works. So the turret can traverse 360 degrees with this armor. It has all this armor that prevents any attacks from into that sweet spot, but it does not prevent the turret from spinning and turning the way it's supposed to. By the way, this thing also comes with the first, according to Wikipedia, the first ever made ADS, which is an active defense system for tanks called the Shtora 1. The Shtora 1 is supposed to be a system that automatically detects if someone is locking onto the vehicle and tries jamming it and doing all sort of electronic countermeasures against that missile in order to make it miss its target and run into the ground or explode in midair. This comes after the Soviets witnessed this, the Americans, or more like comes in response to, that the Americans have started using in the 1980s their javelins and their TOW missiles, and so the Russians realized that they have to upgrade their defensive capabilities against those threats in order for the main doctrine of swarming your enemies with tanks, in order for it to be effective, as in the 1970s and the 1980s especially came the rise of the ATGMs and a real threat to armored warfare, and there was a sort of a rush in order to figure out how to protect your vehicles from these weapons who could inflict massive casualties on armored forces very easily. These vehicles, these missiles, sorry, could have been employed by insurgents and rebels and people who aren't trained for years in order to use those missiles. And those rabble, those peasants, could theoretically destroy armored battalions. So it was a real threat to armored forces and the concept of armored warfare. The advancement of ATGMs, especially in the 1980s. One other thing that I want to showcase is something that I think it is what it is because it looks like kinda, but I'm not sure. So correct me in the comments below, but this thing is a sort of a limited is a sort of a snorkel, sorry, snorkel. Anyways, this thing allows the engine to have a raised exhaust vent so that this tank could actually wade into shallow water. It will raise its gun so that water won't get into the barrel. It's into the highest elevation, and then it will, once this snorkel is attached, it will be able to wade into bodies of water and go through to the other side. And this again connects with the idea that the Soviets thought that next war will be fought in Eastern Europe and Western Russia, which is a huge swath of land that has lots of marshes, rivers, and all sorts of bodies of water that for regular army it's a logistical nightmare. So they thought by having all of your vehicles uh, having the ability to cross that country will simplify the logistics and enable you to conduct warfare a lot better. And so this is why each tank has its own sort of wading kit that it can install in the field with relatively short time, a short amount of time, and go through that unhindered essentially. So now we have finished with the armor section and the infantry fighting section, and we are moving on to the AA section and the artillery, and later on to the aircraft themselves. Okay, so now we are in the AA section of the demonstration. We have a lot to go through, so let's get going. First thing is, of course, the ZU-23, which is an autocannon that you've probably seen in other conflicts, mostly in the hands of militias, rebels, ISIS, and the likes. It can fire both direct, indirect ground fire to decimate buildings and infantry formations and destroy light vehicles with ease. It has a high firing rate, probably seen it fire off the back of Toyota Hilux and trucks and everything like that. A very versatile weapon that you can see the SLA are also using it both on a wheeled configuration and a track configuration, just because it is so effective at what it does. This is a continuation of the ZU-23, the ZSU-23 Shilka. The Shilka has about the same fire rate of 2,000, 3,000 rounds per minute. Comes with its own targeting acquisition radar, which is over there. Two places where this thing was highly effective in its intended role. First was in the Yom Kippur War, where the Syrians employed SA-2 and SA-6 advanced Soviet anti-air missiles against the Israeli Air Force. So the Israeli Air Force decided to fly low in order to attack its targets. But then, when by flying low, they flew directly into the envelope of these vehicles, who were able to shoot down many airplanes over the course of the war on the Golan. Second time that this became effective was in Afghanistan. We talked about how most of the Soviet vehicles, most of the roads, especially in North Afghanistan, were were surrounded by hills. They were mostly made out of ravines that were crisscrossing the mountains. So the roads, most of them followed those ravines. There were narrow roads that were surrounded by hilltops and mountains, and the Mujahideen were sitting on those mountains firing down at Soviet convoys, and nothing was able to elevate its gun that high in order to hit them. Well, the Soviets employed several of these, and they proved to be highly effective against the Mujahideen who were sitting on the hilltops, because unlike most tanks and even BMPs, this thing was able to elevate its gun to extreme elevation in order to hit those insurgents that were sitting on the hilltop. So it's a very good vehicle, both in direct ground fire and as a anti-low flying aircraft AA gun. This is the poor man's AA missile unit, the BTR-40 with two Iglas. No, not much need of explanation. This is again the BRDM, but this time with infrared Strela missiles, called in NATO Gaskin. Yeah. So, but one thing that was trouble with the infrared missiles is that if the plane came at you, especially in the 1960s and the 1970s, in the 1960s and the 1970s, most of the missiles, the infrared missiles like the Chaparral, the Strela, and such, that were not mounted to airplanes which could position themselves behind their enemies. Uh, the problem was that if the airplane was coming straight at you, you would not have the exhaust visible for the missile to actually lock on and track, which is why we're looking at another version of it, but this time coming with its own radar dish in order to be able to fire and track and intercept the target, no matter what its orientation compared to the launcher. So the airplane can come straight at you from the sides, it can move away from you, and you will still be able to track him and destroy. This is the continuation of the Shilka, essentially a next generation Shilka. This is of course the Tunguska, called the SA-19 Grison by NATO. A combination of both AA cannons and AA missiles, kind of reminiscent of the Gepard in the way that the turret looks like. This, by the way, is its own radar, and we will discuss why all Russian vehicles have their own radars. Coming up next, we have the SA-8 Gecko. What the Russians tried to do with this thing, the Americans were starting in the 1970s and the 1980s to employ better and better ECM in order to counter the Russian threat of AA missiles. And so what the Russians did in response was try to create this thing, which has several radars combined together in order to give the best picture and the best and give the interception missile, as you can see in the back, the best possible solution to the target, even when under ECM jamming, trying to jam the signal of the radar. They were using radars, so one radar is in the I band, one is in the S band, and combine all of these bands of radars into a single picture in order to give the missile the best possible chance to hit the target, even while engaging in ECM and the electronic jamming of the radar itself. So, sort of a way to counter the American wild weasels, which back in after the Vietnam War, the Americans realized they need to give them more chance to actually survive their assignment. So their planes started using a lot more advanced ECM suites to try and defeat the lock on and tracking of Soviet radars. And sorry, I'm talking too much. Anyways, moving on. This is the staple of the Soviet anti-air radar, mobile radar. This is, of course, the famous sort of straight flush. This is the designation of NATO, the straight flush radar. This is the pincer, the axis on which the Soviet anti-air defenses. It's what connected all of it together. Uh, what how the Soviet battery was made up was essentially one of these in the center, and five of these. This is the SA-6 gainful missile, as you can see, pretty large, pretty large missiles indeed. So what they built was a sort of a star configuration with each point was one of these, and in the middle was one of those. And this thing would locate, track, and direct missiles towards the targets that it could find. The wild weasels that we talked briefly earlier, and we also talked about them in the last part, in the last time we saw the RACS Air Force. We're starting using experimental weapons all the way back in Vietnam. These were anti-radiation missiles. They could detect the beam of the radar, lock onto it, and follow it to the source. And once the Americans destroyed this, essentially, the rest of the vehicles carrying the actual missiles, this by the way is called Kub in Russian, which means cube. Doesn't look like a cube, but okay. Anyways, so if the radar is taken down, then these vehicles would be essentially useless because the missiles will not be able to guide themselves to the or even track or acquire the targets. So the Russians came up with this. This is the SA-17. I believe it is called Grizzly by NATO, a more advanced anti-air missile, and the radar on top in the turret, so that now whenever there was a Soviet or Russian SAM battery, you will have to take out all of the vehicles in that battery. You will no longer be able to simply destroy the main radar and render that the rest of the battery ineffective, essentially. This is why also all of the vehicles, unlike what we've seen before in the RACS part, where we had a mobile radar, that most of the AA of the RACS was in some way or form built to link up with that mobile radar in order to acquire, track, and destroy its targets. Here, most of these vehicles have their own target acquisition and tracking capabilities just because of this massive vulnerability that the Soviets detected that the Americans were able to exploit and render the skies over North Vietnam clear of AA just by destroying the radar. So this is the end of the AA section. We'll be moving on to the stationary gun section and to the artillery. So moving on. We have arrived to the stationary gun section. These are AA guns that the Soviets were using mostly. This one is something that was the primary AA gun of the Soviet army up until the 1950s. Looks something wholly ineffective against anything that doesn't have a propeller as a main engine. Unlike this thing, which is a 57 millimeter, yeah, 57 millimeter AA gun that fires these huge shells. Uh, Much more menacing, much more powerful anti-air gun. This is the P-37 radar used by the Soviets. This thing, from what I read on Wikipedia, could detect and track any air target of a range of 350 kilometers with identification from 250 kilometers. So this thing would keep your skies clean. You will be able to detect anything that comes near your neck of the woods, so to speak, with this thing. And of course, this is a huge target for the anti-radiation missiles to destroy, which means that I don't think it was used very extensively beyond the 1960s and 70s, especially when all AA vehicles, after the Vietnam War, came with their own target acquisition and tracking radars. Moving on, this is the Iglapod that we've seen earlier, only in stationary version. This is the ZSU in stationary, and the modders made it possible to switch it to a moving mode, so you can actually tow it or move it back into static mode so it can be used. This is the Dushka DSHK 12.7 millimeter gun. This one on a tripod low. This is the ASG 30, which is again the equivalent of the Mark 19 of the Russians. This is the Metis ATGM. I believe this is also guided by wire. No, sorry, no, it's not. It's possibly either infrared, but it has a self-locking capability, as you can see by those sights over there. By the way, I did try this in a modded campaign on ARMA, very effective against AAF ARMA. This is of course the recoilless rifles that we've seen earlier mounted on the UAZs, and this is an absolute menace. This is the SA-2, the most powerful Soviet-made anti-air missile that they've probably the longest range that they've probably ever produced. If you remember that incident when they shot down the U-2 over Russia, this thing is what they used. As you can see, those things holding the rocket together. Yeah, that means that this is actually stage 1 and this is stage 2. This is space age rocket. So it's a huge menace for the USAF, and any West affiliated forces that came across it. Oh no, my guys got disorientated and went for a walk, it seemed. We'll be seeing them in quite a bit, but let's move on to the artillery section, which is a little bit short. Shorter than what I thought it would be. So, first up, this is an 82 millimeter mortar when you need mortar things. This is the D30, which I believe was started out as an anti-tank gun and became an artillery gun. I believe. Again, I might be wrong. Tell me in the comments below if I'm wrong. Uh, Possibly not used much after World War II because there were bigger things like this thing, which is a 130 millimeter gun, much more effective. But I think this is also of World War II. Moving on, we have the BTR-40 again, but this time in a mortar configuration. As you can see, there's a mortar inside. If you want to have a mortar that actually can move on the battlefield and move with the infantry to provide support, uh, like creeping barrage, but you don't want to use any heavier stuff, then use this. This is a 2S1 Gvozdika something, 122 millimeter, more like a mortar than an artillery gun, but it gets the job done and is highly mobile. And lastly, we have, in terms of artillery guns, the Akatsiya 152 millimeter, which is the what the Soviets had, the equivalent of the Paladins, and just about the same range of effectiveness, though I don't know how much if it was actually used in combat. Tell me in the comments below if you know. This thing, however, is the staple of Russian artillery forces. This is, of course, the BM-21. You've probably seen it in Call of Duty or any other game. By the way, even in 2022, in the current Ukrainian-Russian war, the way you aim the turret is through this. Yep. This is your sight to fire all of these missiles and actually try to hit anything. This is, by the way, a continuation of that. It's the RM-70 Grad MLRS, which I believe can be used to be fired from inside the vehicle, but again, I am not sure. This handle tells me that I'm probably wrong. But okay. And lastly, we have something that you've probably been waiting for. This is, of course, the Scud-B launcher. The Scud. Oh, this is the Scud, the SS-1C Scud-B. Yeah. This one got famous over in the Desert Storm. Sorry. In Desert Storm, Saddam used this to fire both on American forces in Saudi Arabia and on Israel, thinking that it would join the war. The idea was that if Israel joined the war, then the Arab coalition that was working with the US would collapse. Once he saw that it does not happen, then Saddam actually used it as a sort of a vengeance weapon, both against Saudi Arabia and Israel and even Jordan, I believe. Some of them fell in Jordan as well. The main reason why people feared this missile is because it can carry limited nuclear and I also believe chemical and biological agents, making this weapon versatile in the damage that it can inflict to your enemies. So now we'll be moving on to the air arm. and later on we'll be showcasing these guys and their uniforms and their weapons. So stay tuned. Okay, so now we've reached the area of the air demonstration, the Air Force. We'll be starting off for something that you probably recognize. This is, of course, the Mi-8 standard issue Soviet helicopter, medium helicopter that was used extensively by the Soviet Army in almost all conflicts where Soviet and even Russian forces are stationed. It is still in use today, by the way, as a very effective and versatile medium helicopter with a lot of lifting power, and it is a very versatile platform. As you can see, we have several versions of it. First off, it's the medical version. Over there, we can already see a gunship version. This gunship version holds 3 FFAR pods in each side, so 6 FFARs. That's lots of rockets that you can fire on the enemy. I believe this is a sort of a winch that you can raise people from the ground. You can see this thing does have gunners both here, and also one up the back. And I believe this is supposed to be some kind of armoring to the cockpit, maybe. I don't know. We've already talked about the vulnerability of helicopters with unarmored cockpits strafing enemy positions back in part 1, and why it's a bad idea in general. This is another version. I'm sorry that I'm running, but these guys have a blade span that's a long blade span, so I made them very far apart from each other, unlike in part 1, so they actually have to run in order to get there in time, or get there today. This is something that you probably recognize. If you're not, then you haven't played video games in the last 10 years or something. This is, of course, or in the 20 years, the last 20 years even. This is, of course, the Mi-24 Hind. This thing, alongside Russian armor, which again on paper it sounded like it's very menacing. This thing didn't sound like a menace. It was a menace. This thing actually scared the West. It was a demonstration of Soviet capability to adapt and deploy new and frightening vehicles to the field. First off, why this is such a menace? First off, this is an assault helicopter. This is not an attack helicopter, and this is not a transport helicopter. This is an assault helicopter because it can do both. And despite the fact that it can do both, most of the time it was used in gunship role. Now, something that is very unique to Russian helicopters is the ability to carry bombs. I don't know what the idea of Russian helicopters throwing bombs at their enemies instead of like rockets and missiles and guns. But yeah, unlike in Western made helicopters, for the Russians, they can also deploy bombs. So not only that, they can deploy bombs, FFIRs, they can deploy, these are again Malyutka or Sagar ATGMs. These are Concourse maybe, or maybe even something more advanced ATGMs, and can also carry this thing, which you've probably seen somewhere else. Again, this is a FFIR pod for missiles, and again bombs, and even advanced missiles and gun pods for when you want to even more strafe the enemy than that turret, which is already a menace. So why is it a menace? So the United States saw this, and they understood that the Soviets have they have breached the gap. The Americans were the first to deploy gunships. The Americans were the first to deploy helicopters into battle, and the first to deploy gunships, which were dedicated attack helicopters, not Hueys with guns on their sides, but the Cobra and the Super Cobra, and later on the Apache. So these were attack helicopters designed to carry weapons and destroy tanks, destroy in gun emplacements, destroy anything that came across them. So the Russians, they made their own. But this thing, first thing that why it's such a menace. This entire fuselage is protected all the way up to 12.7 millimeter included, which means you can fire 50 BMG rounds on this thing and it will not sustain damage most of the time. This armor is designed to defeat and protect the vehicle all the way up to 12.7. So this means that already all existing light machine guns, medium machine guns, and heavy machine guns are ineffective against this aircraft and cannot take it down. Uh, until this thing reigned supreme over Afghanistan until the Mujahideen started getting the Stinger missiles, and only then was this thing the pilots, the hind pilots started feeling actually vulnerable, because up until then they were the gods of the sky, essentially. Whenever the Mujahideen saw one of these or two of these coming out straight against them, they would flee. They will not try to attack this. They would straight out flee from the area. Uh, so this thing also, as you can see, carry advanced ATGMs. And those ATGMs, the Americans thought that the Russians would use their own tactics against them by having one of these popping off a hill crest, say at an advancing American convoy, firing two ATGMs, three ATGMs, knocking out the vehicles, and going down behind that hill crest. And the Americans actually did not have any ground system that was able to engage and destroy this vehicle before it fired its missiles. This prompted, we talked about this in part one, the development of the Sergeant York tank, which again is a tank that failed in absolutely every way possible. The first time they used it, they had this sort of a podium, not a podium, but like in a stadium where people sit on. So they brought in officers and the media and high-ranking officials from the government all came to see that tank. And once they, the moment they activated the Sergeant York radar, the moment they activated the tank, it swinged its turret around 180 degrees directly, aiming at the area where all the officials and the generals and the officers where they were sitting. It was directly went and targeted them instead, and it did not fire because it did not have ammunition. But and those guys, they started jumping out, and some people actually broke their legs and broke bones because of this. And essentially, what I believe that the American army settled in for is the idea that the American Air Force will dominate the skies over any future conflict with the USSR, and therefore these things will not be able to take off, or they will not be able to actually threaten any U.S. vehicle convoys, because there will be so many airplanes in the sky. They will shoot them down before they will even reach their targets. So I believe this is the strategy, this is the thinking that the U.S. Army settled for, because as far as I'm concerned, they still don't have any system, any AA system that is designed to be able to destroy helicopters from extreme ranges. I'm talking about 3 kilometers, 4 kilometers away. fast enough for that helicopter to not be able to fire its ATGMs at the American vehicles. So this, as far as I'm aware of, tell me in the comments below if there actually is. Now moving on to the aircraft themselves, we have, of course, the most mass-produced vehicle of the 21st century, the 20th century, the most mass-produced jet, sorry, of the 20th century. This is the MiG-21, which was a staple of Soviet air superiority in the 1960s and 1970s, and was quite a headache over Vietnam for the Americans. And there is actually a story about this vehicle that the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, was able to recruit an Iraqi pilot who would defect from Iraq. He would fly his MiG-21 over Jordan and land in Israel with the airplane intact. And it happened in something like 1965, 1966, or something like that. And that's how the Israelis became very effective against this vehicle. And also the Americans later on, they found out what its weaknesses were. They found out its turn rate, its climb rate, max speed, max Q, uh, everything. Its weapon systems, how its radar is activated or not activated. And actually, there was a weakness that they found in the design. See that thing over there? The MiG-21 had two radars, one for the front, one for the back. That means that if you come from the sides of the MiG-21, that's essentially his blind spot. He cannot see you. He cannot see you in that area either from the left or from the right, and this was highly exploited by the IAF, the Israeli Air Force, in the 1967 Six-Day War, effectively destroying the Egyptian Air Forces and the Syrian Air Forces because of this vulnerability. And I believe that the Americans also used it in Vietnam somewhere later in 1968, 1969. These were the areas where the NVA was starting to get a lot more Soviet equipment and actually started using airplanes more, I think, again. It's a very good interceptor for its time, uh, but can't do much else. And now this is the upgrade to the MiG-21. This is the MiG-23. You can see these vehicles are a lot smaller than the vehicles of the American design. I don't know if I said this before, but probably I said it already in this video. But again, Soviet Army and Air Force, the Soviet Army and Air Force were built with defensive posture in mind. This means that you don't need a huge aircraft with lots of fuel because you'll be operating close to home, close to your air bases, and you only need to defend your territory, and you're not going to assault over the Pacific in order to attack your enemies. You're simply going to defend your country. And in order to defend your country, you don't need a huge aircraft that is both air fuel capable and has lots of fuel tanks like the Americans have. You don't need that. You can stick with a small plane that's going to be fast, agile, maneuverable, and can do his job at destroying enemy aircraft. And that's it. That's all you need. And this is why we have the MiG-23, which is a lot smaller than contemporary American designs. There's also this kind of a rush, both in the Americans and the Soviets, to design vehicles that have these swept wings that can change their angles mid-flight. Um, this is what the Soviets made. Of course, the Americans made their own F-111 Aardvark and the F-14 Tomcat, of course, Tom Cruise. uh, Tom Cruise in Top Gun, but the Russians, this is what they made. From as far as I know, it was used in the 1980s between the Syrian. There were skirmishes, almost constant skirmishes between MiG-23s of the Syrian Air Force and Skyhawks and F-15s, beginning in the 1980s. F-15s from the IAF, and the IAF won every time. So I can't say how much effective this was, but it was an upgrade over the MiG-21. This is the MiG-27. The MiG-27 is actually the a sort of test for the Russian Air Force to have a dedicated CAS platform. So up until then, they had fighter bombers, they had interceptors, but the notion a vehicle that was a dedicated CAS platform was kind of elusive. So they tried making the MiG-23 into a CAS platform and a ground attack platform, and this is what we got. We have a new nose, as you can see. This nose has a ground attack camera over there. It cannot pan around like the targeting pod on American vehicles, but I guess it can help somewhat in attacking ground targets. Something that is a bit peculiar about this vehicle is most of the time the armaments and the engines and the fuel is centered somewhere around here. The idea is that the vehicle is actually on three wheels. If you played Kerbal Space Program, then you know what I'm talking about. You want the mass center of mass to be straight between those wheels, somewhere around here. So what these guys did, they actually added another pylon right over here. Uh, so no major bombs can be attached over there because the vehicle would then simply go up and rest on its engine. So be careful with that when you're employing this vehicle. This is not existent. This is a joke. Okay? This is a joke. This is the actual MiG from the original Top Gun movie from 1976. The producers, obviously, back in the end of the 1980s, yeah, 1986, obviously did not have any access to actual MiGs, or did they have any ability to simulate MiGs in their movie. But uh, Tom Cruise had to have an antagonist, so they took these. This is actually an F5 of Northrop Grumman. I forgot the name of the manufacturer, but this is an F5 essentially. This is an American vehicle, a interceptor. You can see it has two guns over here, and they painted it black. They painted it black because it has to be ominous. If you've seen any airplane movie from 1980s and 1990s about Soviet planes, then all of the Soviet planes are black. Don't know why. It looks menacing. It looks scary. So in order to make the audience feel scared, like, oh, these are the bad guys, so they painted it black. So there's also this star over there, so that you will identify. Yeah, this star is the Soviet Air Force insignia, right? Yeah. No need for camo on your vehicles, despite all of your other vehicles having camo patterns. We don't need that. Paint it black. So, yeah, this is possibly added by the mod devs so that the SLA will have a more advanced version of an interceptor other than MiG-21s and MiG-23s, where they would come up against F-16s, which would more than likely be able to down from this point everything over there all the way up to the start of the Mi-8 and everything else. they will be the F-16s of the Royal Saharani Air Force will be able to down all of these in a straight combat. So the devs added this thing to have an sort of better AA capability and interception capability for their Air Force, essentially. Okay, this is the Su-22, which is the original ground pounder CAS platform for the Soviet Army. It was made somewhere in the end of the 1950s, I believe, at the start of the 1960s. At the start of the 1980s, it was already obsolete, although I believe it was still used, for instance, in the Polish army, all the way up till the 2000s, maybe. But this is again because this vehicle can carry a lot of munitions and heavy munitions, and it was kind of hard to replace it in its intended role, but it was very outdated by the end of the 1980s. And by the end of the 1980s, it was obsolete, essentially, which brought us to our new vehicle, the last vehicle with combat capabilities for the SLA Air Force, and this is, of course, the Su-25, also known as Forkfoot. I want to go in. Let me go in. Yeah. So this is the Fogfoot. Yeah. Just look at all the ammo. Look at it. That's massive. For an airplane, that's massive amounts of armament. And by the way, these aren't two bombs. These are four. So he has five and two FFIRs and two of these, which I don't know what this for, and two gun pods. And also, I believe this is an AA missile, so it's an all-rounder. And it also has, other than those two gun pods, it also has two cannons right over here. So this is the standard issue ground attack airplane of the Soviet and later on Russian air forces that continues to be used to this day. It is subsonic, by the way. Uh, it cannot use afterburner, which kind of like the A-10 makes it a very slow, low target. However, unlike this thing, it is apparent that the A-10 at least operates in areas where there are no AA threats, or if there are, then probably the F-16s and F-15s of the American Air Force took them out. If there were AA danger, if there was a danger of air threats coming as planes themselves, like enemy interceptors and such, then the F-15s and F-16s already cleared them out. So this is the main difference between where this thing is operating and where the A-10 is operating. So last thing is this is the AN-12, the Antonov 12, a huge aircraft. Let's go right in the back. As you can see, it can carry a lot of infantry inside and can also carry light vehicles. I believe this is for light vehicles, maybe. So this means that the BMD that we've seen he might be able to enter this vehicle and actually do its intended job. Not sure, but this is the tell me in the comments below if it was ever used in that capacity. Anyways, this is the end of the vehicle section, and we'll be moving on to the uniform and weapons section of the actual infantry units that the SLA employs. So stick around. So now we are at the uniform and weapon exhibition. Let's take a look at what we've got. First off, this is the general uniform armed with a Makarov and the commander with an AKS. This is an officer. Uh, Somehow we should know that. This is regular infantry, by the way, carrying the regular Soviet helmet and a and absolutely no armor whatsoever on them. Uh, Carrying the 76, these guys are carrying the AK-74, 5.45 Russian assault rifle. This guy is infantry AA carrying the Igla. This guy is the marksman carrying the SVD or Sniperskaya Mashu Dragunov. This is a regular infantryman. This is the machine gunner with the PKM machine gun. This is the RPG infantryman. Uh, he's carrying, by the way, this sort of something that covers his face because RPGs had the tendency to, uh, because the rocket itself is exposed on top when you fire, some of the I don't know how it's called. Some of the exhaust of the rocket is coming into your face. So there are masks actually that you can place on your face when firing an RPG. That is actually recommended, although many people do not use them. This is an RPG AT version carrying supposedly AT charge. This is an RPG LAT carrying, I believe this is the RPG 2029, maybe? No, I can't interact with them, so I cannot know. But it's probably the RPG 29 Vampire or something like that. The more advanced ATGM. This is the Grenadier with the GP25 grenade launcher under the vehicle. This is what I believe the armored infantry division. These guys are equipped with some kind of body armor, though I don't believe it is a ballistic body armor. It looks more like a flak jacket that the Americans were also using in Vietnam. Not able to stop a bullet, but it can stop the fragments of a grenade or explosive from entering your body. Not that it would matter, because if something explodes near you and you're bleeding from your arm or an artery is uh, is hit, then you will die, and this thing will not protect you. They're also having a sort of a reflex sight of Russian origin, I believe. Again, the machine gunner. This is a paratrooper general. Paratrooper. This is a paratrooper radio operator. This is your radio. I'll be damned. Wow, Soviet technology has surpassed the West in if this is his radio, wow. Wow, bro, this is state of the art technology right there. Paratrooper AT, paratrooper medic, paratrooper platoon sergeant, paratrooper marksman. They're all using the same rifles over and over again. These are the tankers, of course, coming with that plushy, uh, that plushy, yeah. That head cap is actually designed to withstand blows from hard things inside the tank itself, which is why they look like this. By the way, we're using a lot more advanced in Western nations, a lot more advanced helmets than this. This is probably a design reminiscent of a helmet from World War II, so don't take my word on it, but kinda looks like it. This is an artilleryman, an engineer, more like a sapper, infantryman, marksman, ATGM, medic. Again, these guys are carrying this thing now. Oh, this guy is kind of not carrying anything at all. These guys, however, this thing is a ballistic vest. As you can see, it's a carry-all of Russian origin, more advanced than. You can also see the helmet is of Western design. They ditched that thing that the medic has for a more advanced. It seems like a MICH 2000 helmet, common in Western armies. An RPG unit. Oh, but these guys are also. This is possibly a more advanced commando unit because they're carrying a more advanced, possibly AK 101 version with the reflex and the picanary rail for their weapons. They seem to be a lot more advanced than the grunts that are over there. These are the border guards. The border guard, the political officer first class, commander and general. This is naval infantry. This is the commandos. They're carrying the I forgot the name of that helmet that is absolutely incapable, that is made of titanium and still absolutely incapable of stopping a rifle, a modern rifle round. But it looks great. So yeah, they're using it. This is, by the way, the VSS Vintores, which is a supposedly silenced sniper rifle that is using a big caliber with subsonic ammunition in order to both be silenced and be able to kill armored individuals using Kevlar. So this is the whole idea behind this, although its range is kind of limited. This is of course the SVD, like we've seen before. This is this is the AK 101 or 103. You can see it's a more upgraded version of the AK. These are the commandos, which are sort of like the Delta units that we've seen of the RACS, the CSARs and the commandos and the recon. So this is probably the recon. And lastly, we come to this, which is the absolute top secret commando unit of the SLA, the Commando Ninja. Hiya! So these guys are wearing whole black and think that by doing so, uh, anyone carrying FLIR will not see them. They have more. They are all carrying the VSS and have more advanced uh, sights than most. And that guy over there is the sniper, also carrying the SVD. So this is it, and we will now go to the uh, final thoughts about the mod and last goodbye. So now we have reached the end of this demonstration. I would first want to thank you for seeing this entire video through. I know I can sound a little boring and I try to be as informative as possible, but you know, sometimes being informative and boring goes hand in hand. So thank you for staying all the way until the end. Tell me in the comments below if you want more videos like this, maybe on other mods that you have that you want to see. For instance, the mods about the UNSC, mods about RHS. If you want to showcase on those vehicles, I will gladly do it. Tell me in the comments, and like and subscribe if you've been here and you haven't. So do go click on that subscribe button. It helps me immensely. And this is it for today. So I'll be seeing you hopefully in my next video. Goodbye.